All right, now it's time for DataPoint. We're reflecting on the reports of the Kenya Revenue Authority in regards to the revenue that has been collected up to the 30th of June 2025. I want to begin by looking at the global figure of 2.57 trillion shillings, which is the highest in the history of the country and, of course, of the Kenya Revenue Authority. This is 100.64% achievement or attainment of the target. We'll be talking about that shortly. So this is a growth of 104 billion shillings if you have to compare with what was reported similar period the previous financial year. Now, beyond that, you're talking about, so the revenue collected by KRA is split into two. There's the exchequer revenues, which is the revenues or the taxes that KRA collects, but also there's some resources that the KRA collects on behalf of government agencies or departments, which is the agency revenue, which is now rising to 248.3 billion shillings. For the exchequer revenue, it's 2.3 trillion shillings. Again, a record high for the authority. Beyond that, we are talking about to categorization of that 2.57 trillion shillings. It's split into domestic revenue, which has reported 1.69 trillion shillings, representing 66%, and the balance of 34% is in customs revenue of the figure 879 billion shillings. We'll be looking at a breakdown of a bit of that. Beyond that, the major taxes for the financial year ending June 30th this year. The pay-as-you-earn taxes on salaries, of course, you remember the graduated scale, reported 560.9 billion shillings. The other tax head is corporation tax. This is taxation on companies, on the businesses that are run by companies, which is at 30% of profits, reporting 304.8 billion shillings. And the value-added tax on both domestic goods and services, as well as those that have been imported, it's standing at 660 billion shillings, which is an important tax head in the country. There are some new taxes that had been introduced by the government. Digital service tax, which was retired at the end of last year, reported some 345.5 million shillings and was replaced by significant economic presence tax, reporting 461 million shillings. Of course, these are services that are taxed for being offered through the online platforms, including companies that would be operating in the country and they are not resident here. Now, focusing on the trends of this taxation. In June last year, when the then Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury, Professor Njuguna Ndung'u, presented the budget estimates to the National Assembly, the target for KRA was supposed to be 2.7 trillion shillings. Of course, this has evolved over time because the government has been issuing supplementary budgets. The latest one in June 2025 was a target of 2.55 trillion shillings. And that's how the Kenya Revenue Authority has managed to surpass it by reporting 2.57 trillion shillings. But if you have to look at that figure, subject it against the original figure, then this would be 95% of the original targets, which essentially is set by the National Treasury. Now, beyond that, you're looking at the progress that has been made by the Kenya Revenue Authority over the last few years. In the year 2021, which is one of the years we choose to cover these 5 financial years, 2.03 trillion shillings were collected. That time, the increment or the growth had been at 21.7%. Of course, the country was coming from the pain and the impact of the COVID-19 season. Then in 2022-2023 financial year, the year ending June 2023, 2.16 trillion shillings was collected. This was sort of the first year in office of President William Ruto, and that was a 6.7% growth. In the financial year 23-24, ending June last year, 2.407 trillion shillings was reported. You recall that this is also the time that the government introduced the housing levy. So there was a bit of collections that went into that, and also the increment in terms of the graduated taxes were also taking effect. That was an 11% growth that time. But now the current year, of course, you're talking about 2.57. The year just ended in June, 2.57 trillion shillings. The growth, you'll see, has quite dropped almost by half to 6.7%. Now, for the current financial year, starting 1st of July, to June 2026, the target or the projection by the National Treasury is to raise 2.75 trillion shillings, which would be 7% achievement. We'll see how this will evolve in course of the financial year as the National Treasury may set different targets. Now, important to look at some of the key tax heads. For instance, the pay-as-you-earn, which I told you is about taxation on salaries. In the last financial year, the year ending June 2024, 543 billion shillings were reported. So there's a growth of 561 billion shillings, which is a 3.3% growth. The corporation tax, again, the taxes on companies, there's a growth of 9.7%, which you can see there. The domestic VAT has also grown by 4.1%. The betting taxes have grown from 24 billion shillings to 26 billion shillings, which is representative of 8%. And the domestic excise on the various goods in the country has reduced from 74 billion shillings to 69.4 billion shillings. And the KRA is explaining that part of this is could be certain challenges with collection of such on beer and tobacco. Now, the other figure that has been evolving over the last 4 or 5 years is the agency collections. Remember, I told you about agency collections, which are collections on behalf of the government. This talks about the NSSF. There's the affordable housing levy of 1.5%. There's the KEBS and fuel taxes that are collected once you buy fuel at the petrol station. 2020-2021 was at 125 billion shillings. In 2021-2022 was at 131.4 billion shillings. 22-23 was 136.4 billion shillings. This is an important year because it is during this year that now the affordable housing levy was introduced at 1.5%, and you can see the jump of 34%, jumping to 184 billion shillings in the financial year 23-24, and the year just ended. You can see that figure almost growing by about 60 billion shillings to stand at 248.3 billion shillings, which is 34.9% growth. So you can see the impact of some of the changes that the government has been putting in place. So even as you report, the growth in the tax collected to 2.57 trillion shillings, you can also see what is the contribution of the agency fees, because 60 billion shillings is actually more than 50% of the growth you're witnessing over the last 1 year. And we'll have more coverage of the Kenya Revenue Authority reports in our business news, which you take a short break now. When you return, here is what's coming up in business.